Well, many thanks to our Peter Petkoff for this very illuminating and challenging presentation about the theological components that are challenging us as we think about human rights today. And as we just heard from Peter Petkoff, the Conference on Freedom and Man that was held here at Georgetown back in 1964 took place between the third and fourth sessions of the Second Vatican Council, which concluded on the 8th of December in 1965. A number of the participants in the Georgetown Conference served as theological advisors to the bishops at the council, including John Courtney Murray, who edited the book of papers that were presented at the conference that took place at Georgetown. Among the crucial documents of the council was Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, which John Courtney Murray helped draft. Murray's introduction and substantive paper in the book resulting from the Georgetown Conference 60 years ago both stressed that the Church's reflection on religious freedom at the Council was closely connected with the ongoing pursuit of freedom and protection of human rights in social and political life. So it was not simply a matter of religious freedom, but of human rights more generally. Now, Murray had engaged in controversy strongly about religious freedom in the years leading up to the Council. He was effectively silenced by church authorities on the religious freedom subject in 1955. But despite having been silenced in that way and then subsequently disinvited, as he put it, from the first session of the Second Vatican Council in 1962, due to pressure from a number of U.S. Catholic bishops, he was invited to serve as a theological advisor to the Council for the second, third, and fourth sessions thereof, leading him to make a major contribution to the decree on religious freedom at the Council. With Murray's help, the Council achieved a genuine breakthrough in Catholic social thought. It affirmed vigorously the affirmation of both religious freedom and freedom more generally, as expressed in the full range of human rights. This breakthrough that Murray brought about depended on considerable struggle, both in his own life and in the surrounding church environment. Murray knew that following through on the implications of what the Council said about religious freedom would require continuing struggle and would be met with continuing controversy. He explicitly states this in the preface that he wrote to the book that resulted from the conference at Georgetown. Since the Council, the Catholic community has not been afraid to take strong action in support of human rights, action that has often generated considerable controversy. This is clear from the recent history. For example, Monica Duffy Toft, Daniel Philpott, and Timothy Shaw, in their book on public religion, public faith, show that between 1972 and 2009, the Catholic community played a considerable role in promoting democracy, specifically in 36 of the 78 countries that had substantial democratic advances. Catholicism played a major role. And we have seen in other parts of the world the contribution of Protestantism to the advancement of democracy. For example, what happened in South Africa under the leadership of Desmond Tutu, and what happened in a number of other countries where other religious traditions have played a significant role in the advancement of democracy. But these contributions from religion did not occur without considerable struggle, including the loss of a number of lives of church figures. Now today, we once again face the rise of authoritarianism and of decline in the support of democracy. So the religious communities of our day and of the Christian churches in particular, are again called upon to take a firm stand for human rights and democracy in the world that we live in today. Once again, though, there are internal divisions in the religious communities about how and whether to take such steps, and whether they are even called upon to do this. It's my hope that the discussions that we're going to have today and tomorrow will make a contribution analogous to the contribution made by the Georgetown Conference back in 1964 to the advancement of freedom and the promotion of democracy around our world. We have three distinguished scholars of human rights to help us revisit the conference that took place at Georgetown 60 years ago, and to reflect on the continuing role of Christians in the pursuit of human rights today. We will have some subsequent panels where we move into other religious traditions, but this afternoon we will be focusing on Christianity in particular. First, Dr. Pantelis Kalantzidis, who is director of the Volos Academy for Theological Studies in Greece and a member of the executive committee of the European Academy of Religion, will address this question. Then Dr. Megan Clark, who is associate professor of moral theology at St. John's University in New York and author of The Vision of Catholic Social Thought, The Virtue of Solidarity, and the Praxis of Human Rights, will address this question more from a Roman Catholic point of view after we have heard from Dr. Kalantzidis coming at it from a more Orthodox point of view. And finally, Dr. David Little, who is a research fellow at the Berkley Center here at Georgetown, and formerly the T. Dermot Gumphy Professor of the Practice of Religion, Ethnicity, and International Conflict at Harvard, as well as having spent many years at the U.S. Institute of Peace, will address the topic from a more Protestant point of view. So I look forward to these three presentations from three different Christian perspectives. So let us begin with a presentation from Dr. Kalantzidis.
Thank you very much, Professor, and many, many thanks to the organizers of this prestigious conference for including me in the program of this conference. I have been asked to speak about the ongoing discussion in the Orthodox world on human rights and orthodoxy, and also to include in my presentation the contribution of the Lebanese Orthodox academic and statesman, Charles Malik. Peter Petkov has already said many, many things about Charles Malik, so I will briefly start with Charles Malik, and then I will pass to the ongoing discussion. So the first part is about Charles Malik. Born as an Ottoman citizen and educated in an environment marked by Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, Malik was proud of his ties to two other branches of Christianity: the Byzantine, in which he was raised, and the Roman Catholic, to which two of his brothers converted, one to the Jesuits, the other to the Dominicans. Malik, an Orthodox academic and statesman from Lebanon, was a theologically informed philosophy professor, one of the members of the drafting committee which prepared the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. The contribution of Charles Malik to the drafting of the Universal Declaration has been recorded by his son in a book containing his key statements and writings, but also by many other scholars and academics whom I cannot mention here the names due to the time constraints. but who valued his crucial role and his decisive influence, whether in shaping the specific language of any number of articles or in shepherding the declaration through the polarized Cold War bureaucracy of the United Nations. In the words of the British legal historian Brian Simpson, Charles Malik was, and I quote, the most remarkable member of the early Human Rights Commission, end of quotation. Yet, if Malik's contribution to the preparation and drafting of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights gets more and more visibility and recognition, the relationship of Malik to Eastern Orthodoxy and his understanding of human rights from his self-identification as a Chalcedonian Orthodox Christian is still less known and understudied. As noted by Professor Anthony Greg Reber, this perspective has been overlooked by scholars who have identified Malik with Western scholasticism and did not pay attention either to his active participation in the life and the work of the Orthodox Church or to his concerns for the fate of Arab Christians in the Middle East and their relationship to the broader contours of the Orthodox world of which Malik declared himself to be a member. Following Robert's analysis, it is also important to become familiarized with Malik's concern about human rights as concern, and I quote, centered on the human person and not the individual, something that should inform contemporary and future Orthodox engagement with human rights issues, end of quotation. In doing so, Malik did not, and this is the second part of my presentation, in doing so, Malik did not represent an exception to the usual, in nowadays, Orthodox reluctance toward human rights, for the simple reason that at his time, the Orthodox were much more open to human rights. The 4 or 5 centuries of Turkish Islamic yoke, which led to frequent martyrdoms of ordinary people, have contributed to the heightening among the Orthodox of the sensitivity with regard to the individual human aspects of human rights, while the rise of atheistic communist regimes in Russia and in other traditionally Orthodox countries, with their anti-religious policies and oppression, have sharpened the sensitivity of the Orthodox to religious persecution and to the right to the free exercise of religion. Among the examples of a positive attitude with regard to the human rights and the Universal Declaration, one should mention, for example, Russian religious philosophers such as Sergius Bulgakov and his idea of individuality connected with communitarian aspects, Simeon Frank and his account of Sobornost, or important publication projects in the 1960s, such as the very influential Greek Orthodox Religious and Ethical Encyclopedia, which welcomed the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration as, and I quote, the greatest achievement of the 20th century, end of quotation. In 1979, the present Archbishop Anastasios Yannulatos of Albania, he published a long text on Orthodoxy and human rights in which he approaches the issue in a sympathetic way. The Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas, the SCOBA, which in December 1978 issued a statement that recognized the value and the importance of human rights, or a statement issued to mark the 30th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations General Assembly, that clearly recognizes the humanitarian value and the ecclesial and theological significance of human rights as evidenced in the following exhortation, and I quote from this celebration of the 30th anniversary of Human Rights Declaration from official Orthodox instances. We urge all Orthodox Christians to mark this occasion with prayers for those whose human rights are being denied or violated, for those who are harassed and persecuted because of their religious beliefs, Orthodox and non-Orthodox alike, in many parts of the world, for those whose rightful demands and persistence are met with greater oppression and ignominy, and for those whose agony for justice, food, shelter, health care, and education is accelerated with each passing day. End of quotation. Holy Cross professor Father Stanley Harakas mentions that during the Cold War period, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America, especially under the leadership of Archbishop Iakovos, repeatedly adopted statements in support of human rights at its clergy laity assemblies. The same Greek Orthodox Archbishop Iakovos of North and South America marched along with Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, for equal rights and against racist discrimination. Similar statements to those of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America on human rights, with particular reference to the Middle East situation and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, have been issued by the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese, while the Orthodox Church in America, before the collapse of the communist bloc, also made statements on human rights with special focus on the violation of human rights in the Soviet Union, especially the freedom of religion. The Third Pan-Orthodox Pre-Conciliar Conference held in Saint-Pézy, Geneva, in 1986, which for many years, for many decades, until the holding of the Holy and Great Council of Crete in 2016, enjoyed an authoritative semi-official position among the Orthodox churches. So this conference issued unanimously, so with the Russian Orthodox Church included, unanimously a highly significant statement which does refer to human rights in a positive way, stating, among other things, on the subject of human rights the following, and I quote, from the Pan-Orthodox Pre-Conciliar Conference: Orthodox Christians experience divine consultations every day and fight against every form of fanaticism and bigotry that divides human beings and peoples. Since we continuously declare the incarnation of God and the deification of humanity, we defend human rights for every human being and every people. Since we live with the divine gift of freedom through Christ's work of redemption, we are able to reveal to the fullest the universal value that freedom has for every human being and every people. End of quotation. But, however, in the last decades, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet system, a pervasive reserve, not to say rejection, seems to characterize the attitude of many Orthodox hierarchs, thinkers, and theologians toward human rights to such a degree, indeed, that there is now a firm conviction in Western circles that Orthodoxy is incompatible with the modern world and the achievements of modernity and with democracy, human rights, and political liberalism. At the basis of the philosophy of rights, a certain version of Orthodox theology perceives nothing more than the idolizing of individualism and the consolidation of the centrality of the individual, which it contrasts with the socially based culture of orthodoxy. Indeed, prominent Orthodox theologians or official church documents with significant influence in Greece, Russia, and the wider Orthodox world, such as the late Greek theologian and philosopher Christos Gianaras, or the document of the Russian Orthodox Church titled The Russian Orthodox Church's Basic Teaching on Human Dignity, Freedom, and Rights of 2008, go so far as to talk about the inhumanity of right in the case of Christos Gianaras, or to consider human rights as the revolt and rebellion against the divine order, and therefore to connect human rights with human dignity, but also with the concepts of sin and evil, and for that reason to make their acceptance conditional on their prior agreement with the God-established moral norms and traditional morality based on them, while human rights should not contradict love for one's homeland, in that case, the Russian homeland. And this is the Russian Orthodox Church understanding. The same Orthodox talk also about the logic of rights leading to demands centered on the individual and to the threat of anthropological deterioration, that is to say, to a sliding into a kind of human psychology that is deficient in relationality and communion. One should ask, however, how incompatible at the end of the day is orthodoxy and its ecclesial vision with the emergence of the subject and even with individuality? How communitarian is the ecclesial ethos and the theological self-consciousness of Eastern Orthodoxy? And why should we be forced to consider as self-evident the identification between communal and communitarian? The Orthodox detractors of human rights argue, following Yanaras, who is in some ways paradigmatic for the Orthodox criticism of human rights, that the whole paradigm of modernity was grounded on an egocentric perspective inherently linked with a non-relational, autonomous, and individualistic understanding of human person. The same circles systematically promote the idea of a radical incompatibility between orthodoxy and human rights, as, for example, in the introduction of the official document, the Russian Orthodox Church's basic teaching on human dignity, freedom, and rights. Since 2009, the Russian Orthodox Church makes use of the human rights language in a polemical way, as a means to fight against the so-called liberal agenda in favor of a rhetoric of traditional values. To this end, it is important to see how this anti-human rights rhetoric is used in the context of the present invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It is quite clear so far that human rights language is being used to justify an illegal aggression and to construe a threatening, inimical image of the West that does not correspond to the reality. This type of orthodox opposition toward human rights gives often the impression of a philosophical and cultural affinity between Orthodoxy and Islam that contributes to an image of an anti-Western Orthodoxy far from the European standards. This unfortunate impression has been strengthened by recent statements of Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church. I will skip these statements, but these are really amazing, the way Patriarch Kirill understands the affinity between Orthodoxy and Islam. In recent years, however, there has been a clear turn toward a more positive approach to the question of rights from an Orthodox viewpoint, expressed chiefly in the writings of distinguished clergy and lay theologians, among them a moderate approach by the late Metropolitan John Zizioulas of Pergamon, the most prominent Orthodox theologian in recent times, and most importantly, by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the highest ecclesiastical authority in the Orthodox Church, who did not hesitate to hold public discourses in which he openly stressed the theological legitimacy of human rights and affirmed on behalf of the Orthodox the critical acceptance of the principle of rights. The theology of personhood and Eucharistic ecclesiology or ecclesiology of communion are probably the most important Orthodox contributions to the 20th century theology and to the ecumenical movement. Unfortunately, despite its significance, the theology of personhood did not exert its influence in social issues, especially those that are related to the modernist phenomenon, while sometimes it was understood, even by its initiators, mainly by Christos Yanaras, as opposed to modernity and particularly to human rights. Today, there is an urgent need to overcome the misfortunate and tragic misperception. There is a very nice quotation from Father John McGuigan, and I will skip in order to go for the conclusion. The challenge for the theology of personhood and Orthodox theology in general, after the first bold and significant steps taken during the 1970s and the 1980s, is to consider the anthropological consequences of its original theological formulations about personhood and otherness, and connect them with the ongoing discussion on the emergence of the subject and its significance for the rise of modernity, postmodernity, and the autonomous self. If the theology of the personhood succeeds in uniting the individual and the social or communal, it could further contribute to the achievement of the sought synthesis of orthodoxy with modernity and to the correction of the excesses of both individualism and communitarianism. This synthesis we seek seems to be successfully achieved by the recent official document of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, titled For the Life of the World, toward a social ethos of the Orthodox Church. The document was composed by a special commission of Orthodox scholars appointed by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew and blessed for publication by the Holy and Sacred Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kalitsidis. It's very grateful to have this presentation about contributions coming from Orthodoxy, which is a very important contribution, especially given what Charles Malik did in drafting the Universal Declaration as a major contribution coming from the Orthodox tradition. Now we can turn to Professor Megan Clark, who will give us some insights into the contributions of Roman Catholicism on human rights today and in history as it has evolved. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here. Being here at Georgetown and being responsible to talk about Catholicism's development and role when it comes to human rights after the Universal Declaration, it's a unique thing because if we're honest, Catholicism's resistance to human rights and rights language is part of why the original conference was needed. It's part of why the debates and the work that Murray and others were doing at Vatican II were needed, because Catholicism, despite the profound role of actual Catholics along the way within the development of the Universal Declaration and in the movements that led to it, was very hesitant to embrace religious freedom and human rights language more broadly. And yet, not just with Vatican II, but in particular with Pope John the 23rd, things began to change, and they changed so radically and so completely in a lot of ways that it is quite odd for Catholicism if we're honest about the way in which change tends to happen. In 1963, Pacem in Terris offers essentially a Catholic declaration of human rights. And from that point on, human rights language would become central to Catholic social thought's response to global political, social, and economic concerns. Something I've written about elsewhere, John the 23rd adopted and adapted the language found in secular rights theory, seeking to transcend the common debates of his day concerning what to prioritize and the scope. His foundation was simple, and this is from Pacem in Terris. Any human society, if it is to be well-ordered and productive, must lay down this principle, namely that every human being is a person, and that his or her nature is endowed with intelligence and free will, indeed precisely because he or she is a person, they have rights and obligations flowing directly and simultaneously from this nature. These rights are universal and inviolable, so they cannot in any way be surrendered. Human rights, then, are understood in Catholic social thought as entitlements that carry with them profound responsibilities to human flourishing. And for this, it attempts to be contextual but never individualistic or relativistic. John the 23rd sidestepped the emerging Cold War fault lines of civil, political versus economic, social rights, which would plague for many years kind of what comes out in the United Nations and kind of international relations more broadly, as that debate about what are the real universal rights, and instead focuses on a holistic vision of rights and responsibilities together. And the list of rights that follows in Pacem in Terris is what you would expect if you have read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At that point, it's fairly standard and moves as you would expect it to. But again, the key point is that none of them, as they're articulated in Pacem in Terris, can or should be interpreted individualistically. There is, as we heard at the beginning, a focus, as Malik himself focused in his essay, on person rather than individual. John envisioned a natural and integrated relationship between different levels of society, and there's this kind of holistic view of human society that Catholic social thought has more broadly. And it has underneath it a deep optimism. And it is this deep optimism which often receives the most criticism. And so Georgetown's own, the late Father Drew Christiansen, noted that the encyclical's endorsement of the United Nations came in for the harshest criticism and the most profound doubts, including from Reinhold Niebuhr and John Courtney Murray. Upon embracing a human rights framework, Catholicism called for a global cooperation that, if we are honest, has never quite materialized. And as is often apparent these days, neither that global structure nor Catholic social thought itself really has a good way. It struggles to envision how to grapple with conflict wherein you are not dealing with people of goodwill, where you cannot assume goodwill, and where do we go from there when we are interacting on a matter of human rights, and it isn't between all persons of goodwill as who's at the table. In my very limited time with you today, I want to emphasize one aspect of the human rights agenda where I think Catholicism has made a significant contribution to the broader human rights project, and that is the articulation of the right to development, and the right to development as something that is holistic and integrated. And it is here that I think Catholic social thought answers one of the concerns Malik has in his essay on the metaphysics of freedom here, which he expressed a deep concern with what he saw as kind of a growing focus on group freedom over individual freedoms. And that, quote, the more you absolutize the group, the less chance the individual person will have to breathe, he argued. But here I think the contribution of Catholic social thought to the wider understanding of what a right to development might look like pushes past his concerns and gives a vision that most specifically challenges those who would frame human rights either as only looking for the kind of group focus and leaning into the government and the communal concerns in socialism and other forms that he was concerned with, as well as what would become more dominant, which is a very individualistic approach, and which overlaps with the calls for prioritizing economic and social rights that we see within interpretations, criticisms, and developments of human rights, particularly from the Global South. For Paul VI, coming later, the right to development emerges as a key way to contribute to conversations not only on human rights, but neocolonialism and growing globalization. It is one place where his address to the United Nations, when you look at this period as a whole, you see a very short time, Catholicism moves from being very hesitant to kind of pushing the envelope and pushing the broader conversation. The right to development is an explicit expansion of the human rights framework to incorporate not only an adequate standard of living, but to include the rights of communities and agency. This comes in 1967 in Catholic social thought, close to 20 years before the United Nations Declaration on a Right to Development in 1986. And its clearest articulation comes in the 1971 Synod of Bishops, document Justice in the World, which states, an awareness of the right to development. The right to development must be seen as a dynamic interpenetration of all those fundamental rights upon which the aspirations of individuals and nations are based. Participation constitutes a right which is to be applied in the economic, social, and political fields, end quote. Emphasizing the rights of self-determination and participation in the shaping of the development of one's own community. the Synod develops the themes from Paul VI and challenges the view of development that for decades afterwards would dominate secular, economic, and development discourse for, if we're honest, most of the 20th century. It is where we see the intersection, I would say, ongoing between Catholicism and international politics at the United Nations. It is the place of convergence that we see when, in 2000, the UNDP and the United Nations adopted a more integrated and holistic view of how to measure development and how to measure and count people. It's what we see in the Sustainable Development Agenda, and a place where often it is, how do we keep the focus on those who are the poorest? And this is the last point I will make, which is within the Catholic understanding of a right to development that gets developed, we get a particular focus on the rights of the poor. And this gets developed at Vatican II by Dom Helder Camara and others from Latin America, afterwards by people like Ignacio Ellacuría. And we hear the same today in Fratelli Tutti, lamenting that in practice, human rights are not equal for all. I found myself, when I was reading Freedom and Man, of really wishing to, what would it look like if Malik, Courtney Murray, and Ellacuría were having a conversation about human rights. Practically, I think this matters not only for kind of the idea and the theory behind human rights, but whether or not our focus and our understanding of the impact of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights continues to actually change and matter for the development and the lived realities of people living on the margins, those whose rights are most easily violated. And that where, if we had more time, you would see, or we could see very clearly, that in practice, those on the ground, faith-based communities, and in particular, I myself have looked at the work of women religious, are often on the ground putting into practice a more integrated vision that human rights is about development and about having a say in the development of your own community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark. It's very good to hear that your stress on the right to development as an important contribution from the Catholic tradition. Now we turn to Professor David Little, who has, I'm sure, much to tell us about the contributions coming from the Protestant tradition and some of its implications for where we are today. So, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and let me express my appreciation to you and Michael and others who've organized this conference. I'm very pleased to be a part of it. The title of my brief remarks is Protestant Contributions to Human Rights. At the end of his groundbreaking study of the nature and development in Europe of the idea of natural rights from the 12th to 17th century, Brian Tierney states that the widespread antipathy to natural rights language in the 19th century was not the end of the story. In response to World War II, there was a great revival, he says, of the natural rights tradition, exemplified above all in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Tierney devotes much of his book to the contribution of the late medieval Catholic conciliar movement to natural rights thinking, but observes that, quote, further development in the early modern world was almost entirely the work of Protestant political theorists, mainly Calvinist theorists to be exact. Lutherans made some important contributions, but Calvinist cogitation was indispensable to the practical impact of natural rights theory in relation to the revolutions that took place in Holland, France, Scotland, England, and America from the 16th to the 18th centuries. As to representative figures, I have in mind individuals squarely in the tradition, such as John Calvin himself, Theodore Beza, Philippe du Mornay, Johannes Althusius, and others closely related to the tradition like Hugo Grotius, George Buchanan, John Milton and John Locke, along with English and Puritan leaders, including specifically Roger Williams. There are two general principles identified or implied in Tierney's book that animated and challenged the thinking of the Calvinist theorists, and that are, I think, of the greatest importance to the formulation of the Universal Declaration and subsequent human rights documents. Particularly, I have in mind the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic Social Rights. The first principle is the natural right of self-defense is the greatest of rights, establishing the sovereignty of the people and the rule of law as the basis of government. Principle 2, the idea of natural rights are not derived from theological claims, but from an understanding of human beings as morally accountable by nature. The exact relation of theological claims to natural rights stands as a perplexing and sometimes divisive issue. The first principle, this centrality of the right of self-defense and its connection to popular government and the rule of law, was at the heart of Calvinist revolutionary thinking. It was justified by claims found in Roman political and legal thought that were developed by Catholic natural rights theorists and likely conveyed to Calvin and Buchanan and thence to others by John Mayer, a Scottish conciliarist who influenced both Calvin and Buchanan. Human beings as individuals and peoples, individual and collective in the tradition, naturally possess rights. They are enforceable entitlements, as we may call them, to protect and promote their lives and livelihoods. Any arbitrary use of force understood as trampling on those rights for personal benefit constitutes a gross violation. It is rightly subject to armed resistance if necessary and duly restrained, aimed at thwarting the violation and permanently preventing its recurrence by protecting and promoting the rights of the people. Accordingly, popular sovereignty, commonly expressed as the right or freedom of the people, becomes the basis of government, and the rule of law or constitutionalism becomes the means by which government prevents the recurrence of arbitrary force, or tyranny as it was called. With some differences of interpretation, this line of argument generated expressions of independence from tyrannical government, most particularly or prominently, let's say, in the American Revolution. It should be emphasized that for conciliarists and the Calvinists who followed them, arbitrary force included not just unwarranted attack on life and integrity of the body, but also on property broadly understood. Wanton deprivation or neglect of the basic needs of survival, particularly economic. I have no time to go into the economic background of the natural rights tradition and the provisions for those rights, but also social and cultural, family, association, and education in the case. All of these things were involved in the natural rights reflection on what basic rights constitute, and thus the violation of property was understood not just wealth and land, but also these other things. These thoughts influenced the drafting of the UDHR and the ICCPR and the ICESCR in important ways. The preamble to the UDHR says, whereas it is essential if people, as the text ought to say, if people are not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. In their deliberations, the drafters devoted considerable attention to the placement and articulation of the right of self-defense. Moreover, by enumerating civil and political rights as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, they stayed true to the tradition of natural rights. The second principle, the idea that natural rights do not depend on theological claims, but on natural reason and affection, is, to be sure, a perplexing, sometimes divisive issue amongst Calvinist theorists. On the one side, all of them understood what the church had long held, that because the exercise of conscience in regard to religious belief is voluntary and ought not to be coerced, it is necessary to ground the authority to coerce in something other than religious belief. The doctrine of natural law, and for conciliarists and Calvinists, the doctrine of natural rights, served that purpose nicely. In his youth, Calvin himself came close to the idea by indicating that St. Paul in Romans 13 alludes only to the second table of the Decalogue and not to the first, implying, he says, that the role of government is limited to the enforcement of individual rights against material injury, and that trying to coerce conscience in regard to belief and worship is nothing more than a vain attempt to establish what he calls a blasphemous tyranny. In the first edition of his Institutes, he even urges the protection of, quote, all peaceable believers, including Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, end quote, suggesting a rather robust doctrine of religious freedom based on the restriction of governmental authority to the protection of what he called outward body and goods of people. The fact is, however, Calvin withdrew the reference to all peaceable believers in subsequent editions of the Institutes and took the position that while still separate from matters of belief and worship, government's role was nevertheless to protect the outward worship of God and to defend sound doctrine, thereby illustrating the other side of the perplexity. Like Calvin, many of his followers had trouble fully adhering to the implications of natural rights thinking. Wasn't nature severely corrupt and therefore finally unreliable as the conduct of righteous action? And didn't it need, after all, ecclesiastical direction in order to preserve public order? As a result of the tension, the perplexity here that I'm trying to identify, Calvinists took a range of positions on religious freedom. Some advocated that revolution should lead to the establishment of reformed religion, while others, like Milton, Locke, left-wing Puritans like the Levelers, tended toward a more pluralistic arrangement. None of them went quite so far as Roger Williams, who, praising Calvin for his liberal leanings and condemning him for his intolerant backsliding, declared unequivocally that the basis of earthly political authority is, quote, not religious, Christian, etc., but natural, humane, and civil, and that positions of political leadership should not be monopolized into the hands of church members and all other citizens deprived and despoiled of their natural and civil rights and liberties. Williams' argument was not that divine authority was irrelevant to the affairs of government, but rather that it firmly endorsed, in the spirit of the early Calvin, a religiously pluralistic society. Reading Article 18 of the UDHR and the ICCPR, particularly Section 2, no one shall be subject to coercion which would impair freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief, it would be hard to deny the contribution of Protestant natural rights thinkers, at least as background to the drafting of those articles, particularly Williams and Locke, though Locke, by the way, was not as inclusive as Roger Williams. Roger Williams included atheists, non-believers, and so on. Locke did not, for reasons we can't go into right now. It so happens, abruptly leaping forward 2 centuries now, that there is in fact additional and even more direct recent evidence of Protestant influence on human rights in general, and in the drafting of Article 18 in particular. Interestingly, this recent evidence reveals ambivalence about the character of religious freedom, similar to what we just encountered in the historical material. The evidence is reported in an important book, For All Peoples and All Nations, The Ecumenical Church and Human Rights by John Mercer, which discusses at length the contribution of ecumenical Protestants in the 1940s to the acceptance of human rights in the first place, and then to the actual drafting of the UDHR. The acceptance of human rights could not be taken for granted in 1945 when the UN was being established. Indeed, there was considerable resistance to the whole idea, not least at the US delegation to the founding conference in San Francisco. One delegate openly exclaimed that the idea of human rights means nothing. Other members were more sympathetic, but still deeply pessimistic about the prospects of creating a Human Rights Commission as the first step to formulating and codifying universal human rights standards. Mercer shows that it was the indefatigable efforts of one of the book's heroes, O. Frederick Nolde, an American Lutheran seminary professor, assisted by one or two like-minded Jews and Catholics, that successfully rallied support in a fateful late afternoon meeting with the US delegation in May 1945. According to the report of one observer, it was that afternoon that the Human Rights Commission was born. But that is not all. Nolde and his associates also made signal contributions to the drafting of what became Article 18, and he influenced other aspects of the document as well. In the fall of 1947, the Commission was struggling to overcome sharp controversies among members over the meaning and scope of religious freedom. Nolde weighed in actively. He presented specific proposals for wording of the article, some of which were actually adopted in the final version of the UDHR. Much of the impulse for the protection of religious freedom originally came from the Protestant missionary movement. Leaders thought emphasizing religious freedom in places like Latin America would be a means of advancing their version of Protestant Christianity, making the Human Rights Campaign part of a Christian crusade. That outlook converged with similar attitudes in other quarters, such that it was proposed quite aggressively that the preamble to the UDHR includes specific references to the deity and to the spiritual destiny of humankind. Those making such proposals could not imagine a universal declaration of human rights without a specific religious foundation. Nolde and his colleagues came to a different view. Having interacted with people holding widely divergent opinions about religion, he concluded that freedom demands a broader base than can be offered by religion alone, and more pointedly, that the Declaration is intended to affirm that people have a right to believe as they see fit. It is not intended to declare what they should believe. Nolde's view, in fact, prevailed. The Human Rights Committee, constituted to offer authoritative opinions on the meaning of the instruments, declares that, quote, Article 18 protects theistic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs, as well as the right not to profess any religion or belief. The terms belief and religion are to be broadly construed. I will conclude with a brief reference to a recent book by Jean Zubovich. It's called Before the Religious Right, Liberal Protestants, Human Rights, and the Polarization of the United States. I'm almost done. The book is best understood as one of a number of recent volumes inspired by the eminent American historian David Hollinger, who has led the way in studying the rise and fall of liberal or ecumenical Protestants in the mid-20th century. The Hollinger School holds basically that historians have overlooked the contribution of liberal Protestants to a group of social activities and concerns, economic, racial, international justice. Human rights, as Zubovich points out, is part of that program for social reform. Zubovich details the contribution that ecumenical Protestants during this period made to the FDR New Deal, a Truman Fair Deal, in regard to human rights, and quotes clearly that the many liberal Protestants worked, in fact, with the State Department to achieve those concerns. The other side, and this is my last word, the other side of Zubovich's story is not so positive. As Hollinger says, in a way, the activities of the liberal Protestants during this period were their own undoing. In the first place, they had difficulty with all of their social involvement, keeping a rather clear theological identity. They sort of lost their identity, mingling in with all the other secular human rights activists. And secondly, they really sponsored or inspired a response from politically, socially conservative evangelical Protestants who really took it upon themselves to combat systematically all of the social reform causes that the liberals had undertaken, including very much the human rights cause. That seems to me a very important story, but a somewhat troubling one. In any case, to conclude, if Protestants have, in times past and times present, made a contribution to human rights, their record is far from perfect.
Well, thank you very much to all three of our speakers, and I'm very grateful to have the input from such diverse and interesting perspectives. And I would like to, we'll open this up to conversation from the floor, but before we do, I want to raise one question to just see if we could get some of the conversation started here among the speakers. First of all, as David Little has just indicated, when the United Nations Universal Declaration was being drafted, any appeal to religion was explicitly excluded. There was no desire to give a religious foundation to human rights or a religious articulation of the substance and content of human rights. And this was because of a deep desire to respect the diversity of religious opinions present in the world. So the question that emerges, I think, and pardon me?
And also Soviet Union, who was
Right.
part.
That's true. It was also the Soviet Union. But it was not only the Soviet Union. There was a lot of discussion among people in the drafting committee about the reality of diversity, and coming from India, for example. And so the interesting question that emerges for us in thinking about this topic from a religious and Christian point of view is, what role can religion play in the midst of these kinds of issues in a pluralistic world like the world we live in today? Is it to be just marginalized or forgotten or left out? Or can religion play a positive role in some way without infringing upon the religious beliefs of those who are not sharing those beliefs? I just want to open that up for a conversation. Any of you like to say something about that topic?
Maybe Megan, because she was the one who spoke less.
Could you say that, speak to the audience so they can hear you, not just me?
Yeah, maybe Megan should start, because she was the one who spoke less than. Yeah.
I think it was about 2005, 2006, Amartya Sen published an article in Philosophy and Public Affairs entitled "Elements of a Human Rights Theory," in which he raises precisely the the challenge that the wider human rights conversation has, which is in avoiding conversations about why, it can get very hard to motivate people to stay invested and to provide a deeper philosophical underpinning for why it is that these rights get prioritized. And I think where religious, and not just Christian, but kind of all of the religious traditions come in, is that we all have a way of arguing for the why. I think the challenge is whether or not, as religious actors ourselves, we start from a place of respecting pluralism and religious freedom in general. And so do we make the space for the argument that I make within Catholic theology may be different from the argument that gets made by Islamic scholars writing about human rights, and then Orthodox scholars, even within Christianity, are making about human rights, and whether or not we can have that space for conversation. So I would argue that the role for religious traditions is there. We just have to, it has to come with a great deal of humility, I think, in making space for the others. But I think we see now the fragility of whether or not people see human rights as persuasive, as something people are really committed to, makes the role of religion more important, not less, than it was in 48.
David, do you want to comment on that?
One reason I brought up the natural rights tradition is that there is built into that tradition the understanding or claim that these rights are not divinely based. They are naturally based. And that has caused problems for the Christian church. On the one hand, the Christian church itself, as we all know, has long argued that there is a natural foundation to toleration. That is, it is wrong to coerce conscience. That's in Thomas, that's back in Tertullian, that goes way, way back. So the idea of coercing conscience is wrong. If that's the case, then we must look for some other foundation for the use of coercion. And what are the limits of that use of coercion? I think that's deep, and it's interesting that Christians have kept struggling over what to make of that. Because if you go too far, as some of the liberal Protestants, you drift off into simply a secular worldview and lose any kind of identity. My own contribution would be following Roger Williams. The grounds for natural rights are independent. You do not need religious foundation for them. The right of self-defense is, as the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence in effect says, self-evident. That seems to me pretty clear. Self-defense is something very close to a self-evident right. Witness the attack by Russia on Ukraine. Nevertheless, a religious believer believes in a God who endorses a plural society and activates the congregations relevant in supporting that approach. That doesn't make in any way an official religious endorsement, but it uses the power and influence of religious communities to endorse a religiously pluralistic, impartial regime. That seems to me the proper combination.
Dr. Kalitsidis?
Just very few words. I think in connection to your initial remark and to your question, I would say that one important thing for churches and religious communities is to provide theological resources to the discussion for human rights. And to use just an example, I will refer to the recent official document of the Ecumenical Patriarchate for the Life of the World, in which there is a clear reception and positive affirmation about human rights. This document says something like, I can't give you the exact reference, but says something like, as Orthodox Christians, we should endorse the language of human rights, not because the language of human rights is the fullness of our faith and theology, but because this guarantees a minimum of justice freedom, solidarity, etc., etc. So, in conclusion, when we have to do with this kind of, let's say, convergent documents, we should not look for the fullness of our theological truth, but we should to find ways of cooperating with the others and points of convergence. And one point of convergence, in my understanding from the today discussion and presentations, I think, and maybe this is something to reflect for the future, is the notion of personhood and person, which was very strong present in Malik's writings, and which could serve as a point of convergence for the discussion among theologians and about human rights.
So we'll open it up to the floor. Any questions coming from anyone here in the audience, please feel free to raise them. And we have a microphone here, right up toward the front here, toward Jose Casanova.
Yes,
Jose.
yes, thank you. Let me stand up. Listening to all three of you, there was a moment in which you point out from a relatively unanimous support for the discourse to a moment in which this is not so. You began with how up to the 80s, within the Orthodox tradition, you have no problem, then something happens. You mentioned that still the religious sisters are the ones doing the work, but they have no discourse of human rights. And you pointed out how precisely the moment of the separation of liberal Protestantism and the emergence of the evangelical resistance to it. Today we find the same division within the Catholic Church, within Orthodoxy. And so the question is precisely under which conditions we can somehow, once again, bring the unanimous voice of leaders into the public sphere. Because on the one hand, it's very clear that the churches, religious groups, continue doing the work. What they have lost is the voice, and this is the argument was made also by Peter Petkov, that this was a unique moment of confidence in bringing a theological discourse and challenging even secular society to go further. And this was very clearly what the Catholic Church did for about 2-3 decades. But we've lost this voice. And even, let's say, the point of Pope Franciscus saying, choose the lesser evil. So it's a way of basically avoiding the fundamental question of really addressing this issue fully. So how can we, so the question here is, if the division is within the churches themselves, then the possibility of a unanimous voice is lost. And so rather than being a counter to polarized secular society, the churches themselves reflect this polarization. So how to go beyond it?
Nick Hogan wanted to raise a question or maybe respond to what Jose had to say there.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the panelists. It's really prompted by your question, David, what is the role of religion? And it strikes me that as each of the panelists has highlighted, and as Jose has just said, that religion doesn't speak with a unanimous voice. That's true. But in addition, I think it's that the commitment to human rights has frayed more generally in secular society as well. And so the divisions that we see, or the cleavages we see within religious traditions played out, whether it's about the right to religious freedom or other human rights, I think that also reflects a lot of, backlash against advancement in human rights, but also a lot of uncertainty now about the ideal and about the politics of human rights. So the churches or religions are not immune from those forces. They're part of that politics, as well as, I think, trying to address the internal divisions within. So I think it's a very complex issue to try and get a handle on, because of all of these, layers, whether they're, the decolonial challenge, whether it's the global south, whether it's the socialist challenge, So they're all coming together, and we see those, I think, reflected within religious traditions as well as in the wider society.
I would just comment myself on that it strikes me that the fraying of the notion of human rights is largely connected with the fraying of the aspiration of universality, namely that we can find something that is genuinely common to all human beings. And the pluralism of our world is more visible to people these days when you get the World Trade Center being blown up in the name of Islam. Although it's a profound misinterpretation of Islam, nonetheless, this is the sort of thing that is causing a lot of fraying of the commitment to human rights. And I think that's one of the reasons why addressing the issue of diverse traditions is really crucial. David?
I just wanted to respond to the comments here. I think there are two considerations. One is the sociological one, namely, you did have extensive liberal Protestant influence during the 40s and 50s when the human rights language was up, and that synergism between those things added significantly to the popularity and success of human rights language. As that dwindled away, as we've now seen, that begins to affect the way in which human rights language,
Catholic
it would be the
contribution.
Same example, yeah.
Same thing.
I just wanted to add, though, it seems to me, in my own case, I'm a liberal Protestant, my end of things simply gave up. It disappeared. It yielded to the rise of evangelical Protestants. It no longer stands up and says, look, this is our tradition. What about these Calvinist contributions? What about the arguments they were presenting? This is rather a robust claim in favor of human rights, and that simply has disappeared. You never find liberal Protestants advocating anything along these lines. So that's one aspect of the thing, I think.
Say for the Catholic tradition, yes, there are people who are giving up, but even more, there are plenty of people who aren't giving up. And that's right, the example of the sisters that I've gone to work with and others. But the moral authority, those charged with supposedly being the voice of moral authority, right? The magisterial voice, that's what's fractured and frayed and disappeared. And I think it's a failure of both. It's a failure of humility and a failure of being able to be prophetic. And if you look at what's happening right now in terms of the rhetoric about lack of human rights, but the rhetoric about asylum seekers and migrants in the United States, where there are plenty of Catholics on the ground with migrants fighting for their human rights, but where are the U.S. bishops? Whereas those who are supposed to be the moral, and that's where there's lack of humility and a lack of a prophetic voice.
So we'll have to bring this conversation to a close. We're going to have a brief break now where you can get something to drink in the back of the room. And then at 3 o'clock, we're going to resume with the presentation of the keynote address of this conference by Kathleen Caveney, which we're looking forward to very vigorously. Kathleen is going to speak about the gift of return, what Catholic ethics can contribute to the American understanding of religious freedom. So another stage of our conversation after a 15-minute break where you can get something to drink in the back of the room. So let me thank all three of our panelists again for the valuable presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good to thank you. Good to have you with us.